grazing, managing on pasture, you have to hopefully like sheep and know how to work with sheep. A lot of people who are doing this now are coming in and with other livestock experience, which is great. But the people we've now sort of entrusted to work underneath us, so to speak, but contractually, are those ones who have a good amount of pastured sheep experience.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, we take a look at solar grazing, the practice of using livestock to manage the vegetation under solar panels. Sheep are widely considered the best animal for solar grazing, and they're being used in many countries with great success. In-cat livestock specialist Linda Coffey talks with Lexie Hain, a co-founder of the American Solar Grazing Association. Lexie, who began grazing sheep at solar arrays in 2016, talks about how she began solar grazing and offers practical tips for anyone who is considering the practice. Let's listen.
Hi, I'm Linda Coffey with NCAT Southeast. I am a livestock specialist based in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I am so happy today to have Lexie Hain with me to talk about solar grazing. This is a really cool topic. It brings together renewable energy and regenerative agriculture in my mind. And Lexie, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Can you start by introducing yourself and just telling kind of how you got into solar grazing?
Thank you so much for having me, Linda. I have a farm here in central New York, and I think we've owned a farm since 2004. And I've always sort of been at the edge of exploring ideas in agriculture. Like, what is this? And our first business was actually a niche plant nursery dedicated to green roofs, like living roofs. And we did that. And we sort of played around with that and learned about how to have a farm business that was everything we hoped it would be in terms of having customers and business and success that way, but also all the time and the work that meant, and eventually selling that business. And came out of that with a farm and farm infrastructure in 2015, and kind of looking around and saying, that's great, but how do I pay for the farm?
Yeah.
I should probably move downtown to an apartment now, right? So the other thing I'd been interested in is, yes, renewable energy and supporting that. And Johnny Rogers at NC State Extension had put out some pieces on one document, but also there's a little bit more on solar grazing in the United States. And I read it and I contacted him and said, could I come down to North Carolina and in upstate New York in winter, which this was? Seems like a really good idea. And Johnny gets the credit for just facilitating an introduction to the industry for me, because North Carolina has rain like upstate New York, and it grows grass and precipitation, but it also had number 2 in the country for ground mounted solar, which is the solar that can be solar grazed. And so I got off the plane, I rented a car, started driving around, and you just run into solar sites down there. And I was like, oh my gosh, look at this. This like, I knew it worked by just like being there for 24 hours. This works. Anyway, came back, and I'd had some sheep before, and I said, okay, I want to do this. And I knew Cornell had built some arrays. Cornell's also a land grant university, and I thought, okay, and started putting the feelers out for how can I get a contract for next year. And I did get one. The long story short is I did eventually get my first solar grazing contract at a Cornell solar site, and it went from there.
That's so cool how you used just that one thing and built, because now at this point, I want you to tell about what you're doing now, like from that beginning, from just Johnny Rogers getting you the introduction to the field, from that first solar array. Was it on Cornell property. Okay, from that first one, now, can you describe kind of where you're at now? Or do you need to talk a little more about the progression?
No, we can skip the progression. It's okay. I have a business partner named Lewis Fox. Grew up on a farm, dairy farm in Vermont, studied dairy science. And he and I have a grazing business together now called Agrivoltaic Solutions. Just call it AVS from now on. He and I realized, I did the tally yesterday because I was trying to come up with, okay, Lewis, I should know how many acres on solar sites. We realized yesterday we have about 22 solar sites for managing, about 1,400 sheep, and just 430-ish acres. And of course, that's a shared project. There's many ways that we get that all to work, because otherwise I would never sleep.
No, that's just what I was wondering. If you have employees, or if when you say shared project, you have other farmers that are like working under your umbrella? Yes.
So of that tally, it's like Lewis and I both own our own flocks, and they don't mix. Be glad to know.
Mm-hmm.
And we build out a rotation every year in the winter. We looked at and say, okay, what are our likely contracts? Because the contracts are often annual. What are our likely contracts for next year? And we sit down and we say, okay, well, I'm here on the western side of Ithaca, and I've got these, 200 sheep, and let's look at how I can move them through the arrays on a planned rotation. And then you've got your 300 and whatever sheep, and you're on the east side of Ithaca, and then we've got contracts all the way to Albany. Let's think that through. And then, yes, in addition to that, we now have, and we've now learned not every sheep producer at all is interested or qualified, or just, it really is the kind of skills that you all talk about. You have to understand managing grazing, managing on pasture. You have to hopefully like sheep and know how to work with sheep. A lot of people who are doing this now are coming in and with other livestock experience, which is great. But the people we've now sort of entrusted to work underneath us, so to speak, but contractually, are those ones who have a good amount of pastured sheep experience, and tend to have their own flocks, and tend to also not want to, the contracting side of this, and the negotiation, and working through the corporate culture side of, well, this firm knows a lot about solar grazing and they're building out these arrays, but how do we deal with the fact that the solar site's 70 miles from my home farm, or 170 miles from my home farm? So we've had to kind of think all this through, and part of what we've done this year successfully is bring in a bunch of other farmers to work with us. And this is the first real year that we tried that, because otherwise we're stretched too thin,
Wow. So let's pretend that I'm not in Arkansas, but I'm in New York, and I want to graze a solar array, and I know about you, and I reach out to you and I say, Lexie, how do I get started doing this? What would you tell me?
If you were in New York, I'd encourage you to go look at some of the grazed solar sites, because there are, a reasonable abundance now, which is great. Cornell University has some that they're working on some nice research with, and I would, say call them up, go walk around, ask questions, look at how they manage their sites, and with what additional criteria, pollinators perhaps, or soil science, or whatever else they want to add, soil health metrics. But you can be in Arkansas and ask the same question. I know there is, New York is a little bit blessed in that we do have this renewable energy mandate our legislature put through. So we know there's a pipeline of projects coming, and you can plan a little bit with some certainty. But we all know it's not like New York's in the top 10 sheep producing states. And it's been true of a number of other states. I mean, North Carolina, where we first went, still, I don't know where it is in sheep producing states. It's definitely not in the top 10 either. There's like 80,000 sheep there. So Arkansas is going to get, there's two factors. There's the government, and then there's market forces. And Arkansas is going to get solar. You're going to get more solar. I know some companies building solar right now and planning on building solar. So in Arkansas, the other thing we have is, we have the American Solar Grazing Association. And we haven't really talked about that, but I do, in my spare time, direct that along with a wonderful group of board members and advisors. And what ASGA does is we helped connect farmers with information and also farmers with opportunities. We have so Linda, what I would say to you is you want to get started with your knowledge and background. Other people I say, let's look at the ASI calendar of events and just go to some sheep expos and, listen to your podcasts and that kind of stuff. But for you to actually you really need to learn about solar, and then you need to make those connections. And learning how the solar industry works has been the big project, I guess, that I've been on. That's been my big journey for the past 6 years. And so that's the part where if you join ASGA, I try to share that information and that knowledge, and increasingly just the vocabulary of what we're all talking about and the mechanics and the expectations of these firms.
I have been blown away by the amount of information, Lexie, that you've put out to the world on that network. It's incredible. So I would encourage anyone listening who has some interest in possibly doing solar grazing, definitely check out the American Solar Grazing Association, right? ASGA. I call it ASGA too. Then I forget what the A is. We're going to link to that in the show notes. I think we'll write a blog too, where we'll put the link to it. It's just incredible. And the details that I, as an outsider, would never think about, and just the practical help with sample contracts and sample budgets, and just to help you think through the business end of it. Because I know for some of us, business is the place we really need to learn more and get more up to speed on things. It's not that hard in my mind to graze sheep, but knowing how to do one of these projects profitably and in a way that's going to please the person you're working with, I mean, that's important. Do you work on any of your projects where pollinators are a big focus?
Really good question. It isn't, how do I say this? We are not required to comply with any really stringent pollinator guidelines or regulations on any of our contracts this year. But I know many people who are sort of navigating this course of pollinator-friendly, pollinator scorecards, pollinator legislation on solar sites. And where I've been trying to steer this is, in some cases, and it does come, all this comes from what I can tell, like the best of intentions. In some cases, I'm finding, like I have one of our grazers in Massachusetts. He was able to explain to the town and the solar firm that, bringing in the sheep was actually a complementary thing, that bringing in the sheep was a better plan. But he did have to, as opposed to bringing in mowers. And they did have to wait. They had to delay the grazing until kind of late. So if you're a sheep producer, you might say, I would get on there earlier. And he said, well, I've got to, he was able to get on there, but a little later than he wanted to. And for a number of the projects I'm working on, there is strong interest in providing like honeybee, so solar apiaries. Could we co-locate some honey production on these solar sites too? And what I've been trying to get people to do is plant planting mixes that respond to grazing and then have a rebloom period that provides sort of this ongoing nectar. And there's other ways of, it depends on what kind of honey producer you're working with and whether they need ongoing nectar supply or whether they just need it, in between bringing the bees to the citrus and the almonds, right? But I've been trying to sort of carefully chart this pollinator thing because, and help people understand that the sheep are a better outcome for the sites than mowing alone. And that in general, the sheep and the pollinators can play nicely together if it's just done with a little bit of planning and a little bit of knowledge and not as much rigidity. Because the alternative, which I think we all kind of see, I'm starting to see it more and more, is just turf grass. It's a turf grass blend under the solar site. It's mown. It's considered to be more like a golf course or a lawn. So I'm in the camp of the sheep are in the living things, and so are the pollinators, and so are the predatory insects, and so are all those other ecosystem services and habitat creation. We're all on that side together.
So what you're saying, I think, is for pollinator plants, you can't get on them until after they've had the chance to bloom, and so that means later in the year, and so they're also taller then.
It can mean that. And Minnesota Native Landscapes is actually doing a presentation to our network soon about this, of how they're balancing that. It can mean that, but it also may mean that the plants were all planted were much shorter, and we're set up to bloom and be short and have a finished height that's a lot shorter, which is challenging for seed mixes and maybe not that resilient.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like this is a big kind of open. I think a lot of people are trying to crack the nut of solar and pollinators with the solar technology, because solar, sometimes it's 7 feet tall up to 12 feet tall, but the pivot height. But sometimes I have sites that the leading edge of the panel, it comes down to my ankle. It's 9 inches or 18 inches. So how do you do a planting really of any kind then? And increasingly, we're seeing utility scale solar, so the big solar, be lower and lower to the ground because of things like the steel tariffs, the prices of steel, and because of the very, very competitive nature of solar development.
I see. I hadn't even thought of that, because these are all mounted on steel poles.
Uh-huh.
Listeners, you just have to go to the network, the ASGA network, because we haven't done a good job yet, Lexie, of describing all the wealth of information that you have there. Let me turn that part over to you. Will you please describe what they can find when they go to the ASGA site?
Sure, that's awfully kind of you. The both our forward-fronting webpage and as well as our member network has a few of these things. We have tried to capture the research that folks are doing at universities around the country and globe. And the reason that's important is just things like what Oregon State found about the fact that sheep have lower stress levels. They've tested the cortisol in their wool, and they've learned that basically it is a place where sheep are happy. These solar sites. And so that's why the research side of this is important, is to help document, the animal well-being side of this, as well as the management protocols, as well as the forage growth. How does it affect forage growth? So we have that. We also have the solar grazing contract. These are template contracts. We have a wonderful law clinic that sponsors us. And so we, a few years ago, built these 2 sample contracts that farmers can use. And we knew that farmers wouldn't have necessarily the ability to go and hire a lawyer and generate their own grazing contracts for this specialty targeted grazing. And so we basically pooled all our resources a few years ago and said, okay, what should these look like? So I do know that they're actually in practice, they're used. I actually got handed a modified version of one by one of the companies we're grazing for this past winter. I was very amused. We have those, and that's a living document. We're working to improve it. We also have a bunch of interviews of people doing solar grazing, which is fun, because no 2 people do it the same. There's a bunch of commonalities and common things we share in terms of expenses and experiences. We have a few draft versions of budgets, just working budgets, and we should have another one up there some point later this year that sort of says to you, all right, it is a targeted grazing business, but how does this impact like my lambing expectation, and what is my percent lambing loss, and that kind of thing. So we have tools and resources for farmers like that. And then finally, we do now have a solar apiary contract where we worked with a few, I think there's 5 people maybe in North America who understand solar apiaries, and we had them build out this again, it's a template contract. If you're a beekeeper or you like to keep bees and you would like to add that, a couple members of our board do that. And so we built, again, a template contract. You can find that right on there. You can download it, and there you go. And then we have our solar grazing community. We have everyone, and Linda goes on there too. If you just have a question, you see a solar site in your area, take a picture. what does this mean? What's the name of this? What is this funny shaped thing on the solar site I see? Or is this normal or not? And people post pictures and we talk to each other and chat and have discussions. So it's the place where anyone can join and anyone can address the questions we're all seeing, because mostly, and I think I got a little stymied by some of your pollinator stuff, is there's mostly nothing, like there's so much more to learn and there's so much more to be understood here. So the world is wide open and we're all trying to exchange information here.
And the world is coming. I mean, I see people on your network from England and all over the United States and other countries. It is so cool. And I really appreciate the generosity of the people who contribute to this network and of you in getting the thing out there to share the information so that everybody doesn't have to start from square one, because you've already collected all of this on this network. It's fantastic. So I would encourage listeners to go to that. Lexie, I have so many more questions. I don't know how much time you have, but I definitely want to get you on a webinar with some of your solar grazing friends to do a panel. I think that would be so cool for us to have on the ATRA site. So I'm going to try to get that set up for this fall. I'm really excited about that idea. I guess as a sheep producer, I'm thinking about, okay, I totally understand some of the big benefits as a sheep producer for going to a solar site. They've got a good fence around them. So does this mean you don't have any predator problems, or do you still need guard dogs in the solar arrays?
That's an excellent question. ABS, my grazing company, we don't use a single guardian animal, and we have never. But it completely depends on this perimeter fence. So there's a federal regulation that says because this is a power plant, they have to have this perimeter fence. And so this is everything that you and I are talking about. It's anything that's it's above 2 acres in size. But what I've learned is that, and this is if you're a farmer and if you can engage in discussions with the solar firm, you want to make sure the perimeter fence can actually hold the sheep in. I was at a solar site on Long Island, 3 new solar sites, brand new fences, Linda. And at the one, I counted 25 deer inside the solar site with me because they could just push the fence didn't meet the ground at all in many cases. And there was no tension wire on the bottom of it. So the deer could just trot right in on the bottom. And these were smaller deer, but still I went and I said, oh, this is already grazed. Okay. And the other bit is the wildlife friendly compliance side of this. And again, people with the best intentions, often towns, say, we also want this to be wildlife friendly. Well, which wildlife is one of my first responses. Are you trying to be friendly to? But, the easy thing to do there is what solar companies often respond by doing is they set the posts in the ground, and then they put what otherwise to you and me looks so like, oh, this is a chain link, perfect. They'll hold them forever. They'll raise the chain link up 18 inches. You go, oh no, oh please don't do that. So that we're seeing that. So I'm trying to, and there's also like agricultural style, woven wire. And what they'll do is, I don't want to get into the details, but you can just encourage them to sort of say, all right, can we just have work on the size of this, and you can talk to them about the predators in your area and make sure it's tensioned at the bottom, so that if the sheep are just leaning on the fence, I had 2 lambs. They were like 5-month-old at a solar site last summer, and they clearly just lay down for a nap and then woke up on the other side of the fence. So that is a thing with this is I don't have any solar sites, that are within. The closest one's about 1.5 miles from our farm, but this is 25 miles away. So the good fences are key.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. I had not even considered that the perimeter fence might not be adequate because, I was picturing chain link fence absolutely secure, but you're saying not necessarily.
Yeah, it's worth reviewing. And even, like I said, I've generally had almost no problems with it. But I do know that in areas with very high predator pressure, I have some of our solar grazers down in Texas or Florida, guardian emus, guardian donkeys, people are doing it. You see the solar site signs with right on the outside. We all put our farm signs or a phone number on all the perimeter gates. But, if you do end up with guardian animals, you should put that on there too, because generally it's just, it's just me, it's my farm going in and out. But there are electrical service technicians, and they've got to know, oh, okay, there's going to be dogs. But generally people do not use them.
Okay.
Is the short answer. And it depends on the fence, and you just have to be thoughtful about all this.
Absolutely. When you go to a solar site, I'm sure you change based on a lot of factors, but do you put on the number of sheep so that you can work your way down the array, and then you will have rested the front part by the time you get to the back, so then you come back and start the cycle back again? Or do you have to move your sheep off for a time while it recovers?
Generally, the way you just described, I usually manage a couple sites that way. And what solar grazing is very useful for, when you have it doesn't really even matter what kind of solar it is, because even the very large solar sites are broken up into many smaller sections, usually with their fencing. But most people have what you describe as some kind of planned rotation, where you work your way through at a pace that stays in front of you have to stay in front of the forage curve in terms of how high are those panels. You can't let the panel shading get out in front of you. So you have to make sure, in terms of planning, and again, I don't need to tell you about that. That's something that should be done. Our friends up in Ontario who do this, the first year they saw that this is a 200-acre solar site. It was 6 years old the first year they grazed it, so it was well established hayfield kind of, and they were like, it's getting out ahead of us. What are we going to do? They were lucky. They had a contract grazer who had just the right custom hire equipment that it could fit in between the panels, and they could make hay. They couldn't ted the hay, but they did actually bale about 100 acres that year. And now it's something they do every year, as they build in haymaking to their rotation, and they've expanded to a second fairly large site, another few hundred acres. But the answer is, I also have to think that for me, it's the May-June window of don't let it get ahead of me. I want to stay in compliance. That's what pays the bills. And the other bit that people have to consider, especially, west, a little bit west of Arkansas, is the fire risk side of this. And managing the grazing for fire risk is going to be key to what the solar companies are looking for. And I'm nowhere near an expert on that, but that is something that a bunch of folks who are ASGA members do understand, is that they really want to see major vegetation reduction with the sheep, and the sheep don't start as many fires as mowers do on those solar sites, because the mowers, they'll grab, the rock will ignite a spark.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that's a real thing. I've talked to a few folks about that. So that's where the sheep win in that, because I always look for where do the sheep win? And it's fire risk. Okay, win there. Okay, concern for snakes at solar sites with all those technicians. Yep. Okay, the sheep go out there and keep those technicians safe, right? The other thing people do is kind of more of the mob graze, move large flocks around, and that's more what Lewis and I are doing with a bunch of our core sites now, is moving several hundred head at a time within a rotation. That's what some of our partners at utility scale are doing as well, is moving, larger flocks. And it's a labor management.
And trucks.
Yep.
Yeah. So I can hear you saying there are different ways to approach this. A big question I had is, what about water? How do you provide for your sheep on these places?
Sure. This is where, most of the solar sites that we started out with, that Lewis and I started out with, and that many of us started with, were not planned for grazing. No one knew about this.
Right.
So there was no water. The fences were what they were, which actually were all great. The seed mixes were what they were, and were sometimes really good and sometimes hit or miss. They're getting better. But the water is something that you've got to figure out, each one of us figures out. And a lot of people have like little boat trailers with water cubes. You fill your boat trailer water cube, and you move it with your flock within the site. That's probably the most common answer. there's often a spigot or a hydrant somewhere there that someone just had to know to look for, because solar panels aren't thirsty, so the developers don't know. Like, what? I need water. But the water rights and figuring out the water is a thing I now think a lot about, and I try to encourage, in the solar leases. I was down. So for example, I was down in Florida looking at some solar sites, 500 acres at a chunk, right? And the solar company told me, oh, we sold the water rights to the towns, which is fine. But I was like, there were wells all over these sites, and they'd sold all the rights off. And then they realized that they could solar graze. So poor guy has to haul in the water. There's big F450 something, I don't know, with a huge water tank, and he goes around every morning, and he fills all these kiddie pools with water. Doop, doop, doop.
Oh my goodness.
But now I'm working with developers who now understand this is a good thing to plan for. And municipal water supplies exist in a bunch of, like, Texas, North Carolina. We're turning those spigots on for sheep. And they don't need tons of water, and they drink less. The other thing you should know is they do drink less at the solar sites. Abundant
Because
shade.
of the shading.
Yeah.
Well, I've been thinking from an animal welfare standpoint how nice those solar panels are for providing shade. And I think the quality of the forage under the panels is higher in protein and more digestible. I don't know what you've observed about that. Does it grow well under the panels?
It depends on which site it is.
Ah.
The density of the shade shifts dramatically based on two factors: how high they are off the ground, again, how tall those posts are, and then whether or not the solar panels move. The kinds that are fixed tend to have that dense shade, and fixed panel racking will continue to be built. It tends to be favored on hill slopes and such now, but the more efficient system now are these trackers. And trackers have this dappled sun, and as you know, that can actually mean more production.
Mm-hmm.
There are a bunch of people again, this is an area of research that a few universities are looking at, which is exciting. But I find, by the time you get to rangeland conditions.
Yeah, I'm glad there's research being done, and thank you for pointing everyone to it through your network, through the ASGA. That's so helpful. It saves anybody interested in this field from having to do all this legwork. It's just incredible. I kind of wondered about internal parasites, because in my mind, if you're on a site and you're mob grazing and then you're going off and letting it regrow, by the time you came back, that it's fairly safe. What has been the experience of you and the people in your network about internal parasites? Is it better at grazing arrays, or do they still have concerns?
I think the thing to kind of think about, and I would actually direct you to, I think Cornell's solar grazing page is going to have more on this. Just you can find it through our webpage too. But is the protocol around, in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, the sheep have got to go somewhere else for the winter. They're in their barns. We most of us tend to lay them in the winter, et cetera. But the point is, when you're sending your flock out in the spring, that tends to be the time that you will want to just do all those last checks. Am I sending the healthiest sheep possible out? Have we done our, like everyone's done their FAMACHA? Have they got are they updated on, their CDT? Are they updated on whatever your worming protocol? Because like it or not, it is hard. There are people, you've got to, I catch my sheep regularly, but I don't know. There's got to be people doing the regular, like, okay, every 2 weeks I'm checking, but that gets hard. You're you're kind of out in the field a little bit. So I'm going to say there are probably people doing it. I don't hear much about, about people like losing sheep. So I think what's happening is that we are planning, at least I'm planning, and I watch that. I'm like, oh, I keep track right here. I'm like, oh, I've been off for 60 days. You're like, woohoo. You just have to watch your forage. You've got to watch the growth of the vegetation and the panel height. And other than that, it can build you out. In my case, like, I tripled the size of my farm by doing this. So yeah, it's been good for parasite management. And of course, to start, most of these were not grazed by ruminants. They were, in many of my cases, they were hay fields, or in the Cornell sites are mostly abandoned research arrays or research areas,
Right.
So you start with this very clean slate, and it's kind of up to you as the grazer to kind of try and keep it that way.
If you can get a 60-day rest, that gives the larva time to die off. And yeah, I can see that would be super helpful in keeping your sheep healthy. So do you take out minerals to your arrays? Like, do you keep minerals with your sheep, or is that not really something you worry about too much while you're on the grazing?
Oh gosh, I'm constantly moving minerals around. I'm just picturing myself as you describe this, bringing one of my mineral feeders and putting it on the bed of the truck and ratcheting it down and moving it off the site. Because I know for one of the solar sites I was just grazing this past weekend, I'm like, I can tell I'm not going to be back there till October easily. So anyway, I brought it home. And but no, you do. Everyone brings minerals, and everyone is basically a fully. I think this actually works really well with exactly this podcast and your listeners. These are the people who should be solar grazing, because they know, okay, we're going to provide minerals at all our solar sites, and that is something I keep in the truck. You have a whole list of things like your little vet clinic you have with you at all times. You've got a harness, you've got your different crooks, you've got your different iodines, you've got your Catron, anything like that. And actually, Julie Bishop is a great solar grazer. She's in New Jersey, and she taught me that. I remember first opening the back of her truck. It's like you've got the herding dog spots, they've got their crates, and then the whole thing is lined up, like a contractor truck with everything she needs. She's like, yeah, all my sheep are at my solar sites, until December. They go out in, April, and they're back in December. I've got to just mobile clinic here.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That is so cool. If you're managing that many sites, do you need to visit them? How often? How often do you need to look at what's happening?
So this may change over time. There are actually video cameras that the solar firms have on their sites, but typically those cameras are just on the really expensive equipment. And so when I first started doing this, I thought, I wonder if I can get access to those video cameras. I wonder how often I have to check my sheep. And the solar firm I was working with said, well, yeah, it feeds into this thing in DC, but yeah, I don't see why we couldn't just give you access to the feed. It'll be delayed by an hour or two. And I thought, oh, this would be great. And then you figure out, well, on a 25-acre solar site, and if I'm doing a managed rotation and I've subdivided into paddocks, you're not going to see your sheep at all. So that didn't work. So I had to come up with other strategies. And this is where, my sheep are on a solar site. I'm visiting them. Some people visit them every day. I'd say I visit mine every 3 days. And it would really depend on how far they are from home and which flocks I have out, But if a good figure in your head is, say, I'm visiting them every 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful. I was just thinking through the time commitment, for. And I've heard you say before, this is a type of targeted grazing, and so and a planned grazing. I just really appreciate this whole idea, thinking about land use, and it's very concerning to me how much agricultural land has been lost to development, including to renewable energy. But if we can bring grazers back onto some of that land and help soil health and keep the natural cycles, keep the rainfall absorbing into the soil sponge, all of that, and keep production going, help sheep producers keep their sheep healthier and happier. This just seems like win-win-win. So I thank you for drawing together these tremendous resources for any sheep producer who's thinking about doing this, because we're going to steer them right to the ASGA and try to offer some more information on the site within the next year for sure, to help people. I really am excited about this, Lexie. This is super cool.
It's so weird because, I used to listen to this podcast. I'm not saying I don't still, but like, this is exciting for me too. But it wasn't like when I started doing this, I thought, I'm going to do this so that I can get interviewed and be on the actual podcast. I did it and it just keeps flowing together because it's a cycle that's very positive and it works. Like it's so compatible. The one just links back to the other. And then I am also learning more and more about how well it works and these different ways it works. And it's not without flaws or problems or expenses, not at all, but it does bring together, and I feel like it has all these layers of problem solving that it really does. It's inspiring that way, and it's an inspiring thing to be part of, and it's an honor to get to speak about it, honestly.
Oh, yeah. I would just encourage listeners, if you have any interest, please do check it out. We're going to link to this podcast, and I think we'll get a blog up on the ATRA site soon, because it's a phenomenal opportunity. And just having the community support from Lexie and from all the other solar grazers and professionals who are working on that site, the lawyers they have behind, I mean, it's huge. I think having that source of community support, that place where you can go to ask your questions. And my observation is they're all very generous and very open with answers. I don't see any sense of, I'm not going to share this because then you'll undercut me. I don't see any of that kind of guarded approach at all. So I'm impressed. And I just thank you, Lexie, for your time in pulling that together. And I know you're working on it every single day. I can tell. So thank you.
Lots of tending. It's like my garden, you got it just little bits here and there. Keep going. I just want to, last thing is realize, like, look, the amount of solar coming is there's a lot coming.
Yeah.
And part of what's exciting to me, and I just wanted your audience to know, like, we do need these kinds of people to be engaged. This is the right audience. These are the right people who can be that effective partner here for that solar company. These are the kinds of people those solar companies, frankly need. And some of them don't know they need it yet, but this is the right community to match up. And so anyway, map.solargrazing.org, just so you know, is an app we also made. And so farmers can, and it's included in your membership if you do join, but you can put your farm business on there, your grazing business on there, and then you can put yourself on the map. So just know that that's another thing. And we're working to bring that in to let the solar firms know, oh, look, I know you also have many of them, I have a project in Georgia, I have a project in Tennessee. Oh, look, and now they're building one in Arkansas. And then they can see that Linda's grazing business is there, and then they'll call you, right?
Yeah, that's super cool. What you're tending little by little is building something beautiful. And I just thank you for all of that, Lexie. Thank you. It's incredible to me how fast it has grown from your start with talking to Johnny Rogers in North Carolina to where you are today with so many. I don't know how large the network is. It seems huge to me. You may know your numbers or you may not, because they grow all the time, but kudos and thank you. And are there any other things that you would like to say to sheep producers who are interested in this?
Yeah, I think I'll also say thanks for that. And by the way, I think we were at 350 and we have I think we have a couple members joining every day. It's something like two to three members a day or something. It's kind of like, oh, okay. And that's up, but for sheep producers, I'd also just like to say, for some people, the right fit is to kind of be the one who is doing the grazing work. But I think I just want to remind people there's also a bunch of other roles here that we didn't really discuss. But when I say this is the right community, I mean, these are the people who also pay attention to raising flocks on pasture, have that breeding stock, and therefore that's the kind of breeding stock that will be in demand. So those are also the kind of people we want to be part of our community. So look, I'm going to have these sheep available for sale, and I'm going to sell them to these kind of people for solar grazing. And we also are going to need more of the kind of mentoring role. I mean, there's a few of us doing this, but for the amount of work that I think there's going to be, we are going to need more people to mentor and to guide the solar industry as well as the young grazing professionals who want to get into this seriously. Help them with their budgeting, help them like the way NCAT and ATRA do already. But I'm going to see more of that, more people to think about the grazing planning. So there's a bunch of complementary integrated roles and roles that extend into the rest of agriculture. You don't actually have to be out there in the thick of it, walking down the rows of the solar panels all the time.
Yeah, I hear you. Great. All right. Lexie, thank you so much. I want to have you back another time to do some more levels of this perhaps, or I'm real excited about the webinar idea with you and some other solar grazers on a panel. I appreciate your idea about that. Thank you. I appreciate the work you do. Thank you so much. And I look forward to working with you more in the future.
Oh gosh, me too. I look forward to meeting in person. We'll get there.
Yes, we will. All right. Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Bye.
You too.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.incat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.